Every year, over 38,000 drivers vanish on America's highways without explanation. Their trucks are found empty, engines still running, but the drivers themselves disappear, as if they never existed. Tonight, you'll discover what really happens on the stretches of asphalt where reality bends and the road itself becomes hungry for human souls. This is the story of Jake Morrison's final haul, and why some highways should never be traveled alone after midnight. The rain hammered Jake's windshield like bullets against steel as his 18-wheeler carved through the Kentucky darkness. Mile marker 127 on Interstate 65 appeared in his headlight beam, then vanished into the rearview mirror. He'd been driving this route for 15 years, knew every curve and pothole by heart. But tonight felt different. Tonight the highway seemed to be watching him back, waiting for something to happen that would change everything he thought he knew about highway horror stories. She appeared in his headlights like a prayer answered by the wrong god. Soaked to the bone, thumb extended, standing beside what looked like a broken-down sedan with its hazards blinking weakly. Jake had picked up plenty of stranded motorists over the years, but something about this woman made his skin crawl. Her dress was white, almost luminous in the rain, and she stood perfectly still, despite the storm raging around her. Have you ever felt someone watching you drive, even when you're completely alone on the road? The woman slid into his passenger seat with fluid grace, water pooling around her feet on the rubber mat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the diesel engine's rumble. Her skin was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and when she smiled, Jake felt that familiar chill you get when you hear footsteps behind you in an empty house. She gave him an address in Louisville, 40 miles ahead. He nodded, shifted into gear, and pulled back onto the interstate, unaware that he'd just picked up his last passenger. 20 minutes later, Jake glanced over to ask about the storm. The passenger seat was empty. No wet footprints on the mat, no lingering scent of rain or perfume. Just the faint impression in the fabric where someone had been sitting moments before. His CB radio crackled with static, and through the interference, he could swear he heard a woman's voice whispering warnings about what lay ahead on this stretch of cursed asphalt. But that was impossible. She'd been right there beside him, real as the steering wheel in his hands. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his thermos, the ghost woman's warning echoing in his mind like a broken record. The next truck stop appeared through the rain, its neon sign buzzing and flickering against the storm clouds. He pulled into the lot, needing coffee and answers about what had just happened. Other rigs sat scattered across the asphalt like sleeping giants, their chrome bumpers reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. As he climbed down from the cab, Jake noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The rear doors of his trailer hung slightly open, swaying in the wind like broken wings. He always double-checked those latches before hitting the road. Always. His cargo was supposed to be machine parts bound for Nashville, nothing that required refrigeration or special handling. But as he approached the back of his rig, Jake heard something that shouldn't have been there, breathing. Slow, deliberate, and definitely human. What if your safe space became a trap, and the thing you feared most was already inside with you? He grabbed his flashlight and peered into the dark trailer, the beam cutting through shadows and revealing stacked pallets wrapped in plastic sheeting. Everything looked normal until the light caught something moving behind the cargo. Block 04, a figure crouched between the boxes, dressed in dark clothing, watching him with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. The man had been riding back there for God knows how many miles, listening to Jake's conversations, studying his habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at his unsuspecting prey. Jake stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the wet pavement as the figure slowly stood and moved toward the trailer's opening. The stranger was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and fingers that ended in what looked like sharpened nails. He smiled, revealing teeth filed to points, and spoke in a voice like grinding glass. "Thanks for the ride, driver. Been waiting a long time for someone like you." The scary trucker stories real life had warned him about came flooding back as Jake realized he was face to face with something far worse than any ghost. Jake burst from the restroom as the mirrors exploded behind him, glass shards tinkling to the concrete floor like deadly wind chimes. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees while he was inside, and snow began falling despite the weather forecast calling for clear skies. His breath came out in white puffs as he hurried back toward his rig, boots crunching on the rapidly accumulating powder. The asphalt shadows real-life trucker horror stories warned about seemed to be gathering strength with each supernatural encounter, feeding off his growing terror. A figure stood beside his truck, thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. It was a young woman with long blonde hair and a summer dress completely inappropriate for the sudden blizzard. She should have been shivering, should have shown some sign of distress from the cold. But she stood perfectly still with snowflakes melting on her skin. Jake approached cautiously, remembering the vanishing woman from earlier. Can the dead leave marks on our world? Or do they exist in spaces between what we think we know about life and death? "Need a ride?" Jake asked, though every instinct screamed at him to keep walking. The woman smiled and nodded, climbing into his passenger seat with movements that seemed too fluid for someone so cold. Her skin was like touching ice water, and when she spoke, her breath didn't fog in the frigid air. "Just up the road a piece," she said in a voice like winter wind through bare branches. Jake started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, watching snowflakes dance in his headlight beams like tiny ghosts celebrating some macabre victory over the living. 20 miles later, the woman simply wasn't there anymore. Jake slammed on his brakes and jumped out, his boots sinking into snow that was now 6 inches deep. He walked back along the shoulder, searching for any sign of where she might have gotten out. It was like looking for evidence of a dream, searching for proof of something that felt real, but left no trace. The wind picked up, howling across the empty highway with a sound that reminded him of the voices he'd heard through his CB radio static just hours before. The snow showed only one set of footprints. Jake climbed back into his cab with snow melting in his hair. The single set of footprints burned into his memory like a brand. The highway stretched ahead through the blizzard, mile markers appearing and disappearing in his headlight beams like breadcrumbs leading deeper into some twisted fairy tale. His GPS showed he was approaching the historic Route 66 interchange, where the old road crossed the new interstate in a tangle of concrete and steel. The snow was falling harder now, coating his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it away. At mile marker 243, she appeared in the middle of the road. A woman in a flowing white dress, her arms raised as if conducting some invisible orchestra of highway horror stories. Her hair whipped around her face in the wind, but the snow passed right through her translucent form without leaving a trace. Jake hit the brakes, his rig sliding sideways across the icy asphalt as he fought to avoid hitting her. The woman never moved, never acknowledged the 18-wheeler bearing down on her ethereal figure, standing in the path of destruction. The truck passed through her like she was made of moonlight and memories, but Jake felt a bone-deep chill as her form flickered through his windshield. In that split second of contact, he saw flashes of her story. A bride from 1953, killed on her wedding night, when her new husband fell asleep at the wheel. She'd been standing at this exact spot for 70 years, trying to warn other drivers about the curve ahead that had claimed dozens of lives. Why do spirits choose certain stretches of road, and what keeps them tethered to asphalt long after their bodies have turned to dust? Jake's radio crackled to life with a voice he recognized from the phantom trucker. "She's trying to save you, good buddy. There's black ice on the curve ahead and a jackknifed semi blocking both lanes. You got about 30 seconds to find an exit ramp before you become part of her eternal vigil." Through the snow, Jake could see flashing red and blue lights in the distance, emergency vehicles surrounding what looked like a massive pileup. The woman in white turned to face his truck directly, her mouth moving in urgent warning. She pointed toward the crash site ahead. Jake yanked the wheel hard right, following an exit ramp that shouldn't have existed according to his road atlas. The woman in white's warning echoed in his mind as he heard the screech of metal and breaking glass behind him, the pileup claiming another victim in the blizzard. His GPS flickered and died, the screen showing only static snow that matched the weather outside. The exit led him onto a narrow 2-lane road that cut through dense forest, tree branches scraping against his trailer like skeletal fingers trying to pull him into the darkness between the pines. The road ended abruptly at the edge of a massive concrete bridge that stretched halfway across a deep gorge before simply stopping in midair. Orange construction barriers lined the approach, their reflective tape glowing eerily in his headlights. A weathered sign read, "Bridge construction suspended indefinitely, do not cross." But his GPS had been guiding him here with supernatural certainty, leading him down a path that existed in some digital realm but defied physical reality. What if technology could see the impossible, showing us destinations that exist only in the spaces between what is and what should never be? Jake climbed down from his cab and approached the bridge's edge, his boots echoing on the concrete deck. The structure was a marvel of engineering, with massive support pillars rising from the gorge floor hundreds of feet below. But something was wrong with the construction. The concrete was too old, stained with decades of weather exposure, and rust streaked down from the rebar like dried blood. A brass plaque near the guardrail caught his flashlight beam, its inscription worn but still legible in the dancing light. He knelt and brushed snow away from the plaque, his heart pounding as he read the dedication, "Memorial Bridge Construction, begun June 15, 1987, suspended July 3, 1987, following contractor deaths." The paranormal road encounters he'd experienced tonight were leading him somewhere specific, building toward some revelation about the highway's true nature. As Jake stood on the unfinished bridge, he realized the phantom trucker had been following this exact route for 38 years, trapped in an endless loop of construction that would never be completed, never reach the other side. The bridge had been abandoned since 1987. Jake backed away from the unfinished bridge as the sound of howling echoed from the gorge below, a mournful cry that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The wind carried the scent of wet fur and something else, something ancient and predatory that made his primitive brain scream warnings about dangers his ancestors had fled across continents. As he climbed back into his cab, movement caught his eye in the tree line. A massive shape prowled between the pines, too large to be any natural wolf, its eyes reflecting his headlights like twin amber flames in the darkness surrounding this cursed stretch of asphalt. The creature emerged from the forest as Jake started his engine, revealing itself to be a dog the size of a small horse with fur as black as the space between stars. Its shoulders came up to the cab's running boards, and when it opened its mouth, Jake could see rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw rather than any earthly canine. The beast began pacing alongside his truck as he pulled away from the bridge, matching his speed with supernatural grace. Every scary trucker story's real life that he'd ever heard came flooding back, tales of phantom hounds that appeared before tragedy struck. The black dog stayed with him for miles, running through the forest parallel to the road with an endurance that defied nature. Jake could hear its breathing through his closed windows, a sound like bellows working a forge in some infernal blacksmith shop. Old-timers at truck stops had whispered about the beast for decades, claiming it appeared to drivers who were about to die in crashes, warning them away from their fated destruction. But some said the dog didn't just predict accidents, it caused them, leading victims toward their doom with hypnotic amber eyes that promised escape but delivered only death. Jake's radio crackled with interference, and through the static came the sound of barking from multiple dogs, as if an entire pack was broadcasting from some otherworldly frequency. The creature outside his window suddenly stopped running and sat on its haunches beside the road. watching his truck disappear into the distance. In his side mirror, Jake could see more shapes emerging from the forest, dozens of phantom hounds gathering at what looked like the site of an old accident. Do some creatures exist between life and death, serving as harbingers for tragedies that haven't happened yet, but somehow already have? The dog's eyes reflected no light at all. The next truck stop appeared like salvation through the snow, its bright lights cutting through the blizzard that had followed Jake for hundreds of impossible miles. He pulled into the lot, desperate for human contact and the comfort of other drivers who might have experienced similar encounters on these haunted highways. The building was newer than the last rest area, with chrome fixtures and clean tile floors that reflected the fluorescent lighting. But as Jake pushed through the glass doors, he realized something was fundamentally wrong with this place that claimed to serve the living. Every mirror in the truck stop showed empty space where people should have been. The bathroom mirrors reflected sinks and stalls, but no human figures, as if everyone inside existed in some parallel dimension that glass couldn't perceive. Jake watched other drivers washing their hands at sinks, their reflections completely absent from the polished surfaces above them. It was like being in a world where true horror stories that actually happened had stripped away the basic laws of physics, leaving only the hollow shells of reality behind. He approached the coffee counter where a middle-aged woman in a uniform smiled and asked what he needed. Her voice sounded normal, her movements were perfectly human. But when Jake glanced at the mirror behind the register, he saw only empty air where she stood. The coffee cups moved by themselves in the reflection, pouring black liquid that fell upward instead of down. What does it mean when you disappear, when the universe decides you're no longer substantial enough to cast an image in the mirrors that once showed you who you were? Jake fumbled for his wallet and caught sight of himself in the restroom mirror across the lobby. The reflection stared back with hollow eyes, but his image was fading around the edges like an old photograph left in sunlight too long. Other drivers moved through the truck stop like ghosts, their conversations echoing strangely as if spoken from the bottom of a deep well. The woman behind the counter handed him his coffee, her fingers passing through his hand like he was made of smoke and memories instead of flesh and bone. Every mirror in the place showed the same emptiness. Jake stumbled out of the truck stop, his reflectionless coffee burning his hands through the paper cup. The parking lot was filled with rigs whose drivers cast no shadows on the snow-covered asphalt, their forms becoming more translucent with each passing moment. As he approached his truck, he heard a sound that cut through the supernatural chaos like a knife through silk. A child crying, the desperate sobs of someone lost and afraid. The sound came from the passenger side of a sedan parked beneath the flickering sodium lights, its hazard signals blinking weakly against the storm. Through the car's rear window, Jake could see a little girl strapped into a car seat, her face red from crying and her small hands reaching toward the empty driver's seat. Her parents were nowhere to be seen, and the car's engine was still running, exhaust visible in the frigid air. Jake knocked on the window and the child looked at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. "My mommy and daddy went to get coffee," she said through the glass, her voice carrying clearly despite the barrier between them and the howling wind outside. Jake looked back toward the truck stop, but the building that had been there moments before was now dark and abandoned, its windows boarded up and covered with graffiti that looked decades old. The asphalt shadows real-life trucker horror stories had warned him about were becoming stronger, rewriting reality around him like a film being rewound and played in reverse. He opened the car door and unbuckled the girl's car seat, lifting her out, despite knowing that every instinct screamed against getting more involved in whatever supernatural drama was unfolding around him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jake asked. But when he looked down at his arms, they were empty. The car seat sat in the back of the sedan, still buckled and still warm from a small body that had been there seconds before. The crying had stopped, replaced by the sound of wind chimes that weren't there, playing a melody that reminded him of lullabies his own mother had sung decades ago. How far would you go to save someone, even if that someone might not exist in any way that mattered to the waking world? Her car seat was still buckled and warm. Jake backed away from the empty car seat, his mind struggling to process another impossible disappearance in a night that had already shattered every rule of reality he'd ever believed in. The abandoned truck stop flickered like a broken television signal, occasionally showing its former bright interior before dissolving back into decades of decay and neglect. As he climbed into his cab, the sound of air brakes hissed through the parking lot, announcing the arrival of another big rig that materialized from the swirling snow like a ghost ship emerging from fog. The approaching truck was a classic Kenworth from the 70s, its chrome bumper dented and its paint job faded to the color of dried blood. But something was horribly wrong with the silhouette in the driver's seat. The figure behind the wheel had broad shoulders and wore a flannel shirt. But where his head should have been, there was only empty space above the collar. The headless driver downshifted with practiced precision, his invisible eyes somehow navigating the treacherous parking lot as highway horror stories warned they would, seeking something that had been lost in a moment of violent separation. Jake watched in hypnotized terror as the phantom rig pulled up beside his truck, its engine rumbling with the deep bass note of a perfectly tuned Cummins diesel. The headless trucker reached up with one gloved hand and adjusted his rear-view mirror, the gesture so normal and human that it made the absence of his head even more disturbing. It was like watching someone perform everyday tasks while missing the most essential part of themselves, going through motions that no longer served any purpose except habit and obsession. Can obsession survive beyond death, driving the body forward even when the mind has been severed from its earthly vessel? The CB radio crackled to life with a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, transmitted through speakers that existed in the space where a mouth should have been. "Hey, Breaker 19, this is Lost Head looking for eastbound traffic. Been driving this route since '87. Can't seem to find what I'm looking for. You seen my noggin anywhere? Good, buddy. Been missing it something fierce." The headless trucker's hands moved over his controls with muscle memory that transcended the grave, steering toward a destination he could never see, but somehow always knew how to find. His CB crackled, "Looking for my head." Jake pulled away from the headless trucker, his fuel gauge hovering near empty and his nerves frayed beyond any hope of repair. The next exit promised a gas station, its neon sign visible through the snow like a beacon calling ships to shore. But as he descended the off-ramp, Jake realized the station was completely engulfed in flames that danced 30 feet into the air, orange tongues licking at the darkness with supernatural hunger. Other vehicles sat at the pumps, their drivers calmly filling their tanks as if the inferno raging around them was nothing more than a gentle summer breeze. Jake parked at pump number 7 and climbed down from his cab, expecting to feel the searing heat from the flames that surrounded him on all sides. Instead, the fire was cold as Arctic wind, sending shivers through his bones rather than warmth through his skin. The other drivers moved through the paranormal road encounters with practiced ease, their faces showing no sign of distress as they pumped gasoline through nozzles that burned like torches. The flames passed through their bodies without causing harm, as if they existed in some parallel dimension where fire froze instead of burning. The gas station attendant emerged from the convenience store, his uniform smoldering but his skin unmarked by the cold flames that wreathed his body like a frozen funeral shroud. "Fill her up," he asked, with a smile that revealed teeth made of ice crystals. Jake nodded mutely and watched as the man inserted the nozzle into his truck's fuel tank, the burning gasoline flowing like liquid nitrogen into his diesel engine. The pump's digital display showed numbers climbing steadily upward, but the price remained frozen at exactly $0.00, as if money had no meaning in this realm of impossible commerce. Jake tried to hand the attendant his credit card, but the man shook his head and pointed toward a sign that hadn't been there moments before. and payment accepted in memories only. It read in letters that flickered between English and some older language that predated human speech. The attendant's eyes burned with the same cold fire that consumed the station, and when he spoke, frost formed on his lips despite the flames dancing around his head. What if fire could burn cold, consuming heat instead of creating it, feeding on warmth until nothing remained but the memory of comfort? The flames were freezing to the touch. Jake pulled away from the frozen gas station with a full tank and empty pockets, having paid for his fuel with memories of his first kiss, his mother's lullabies, and the taste of his grandmother's apple pie. The cold flames had consumed pieces of his past, leaving gaps in his recollection like missing pages torn from a beloved book. As he merged back onto the interstate, a procession of headlights appeared in his mirrors, stretching back into the darkness as far as he could see. Dozens of big rigs formed a convoy behind him, their engines synchronized in a rhythm that sounded like a massive mechanical heartbeat. The lead truck pulled alongside his cab, and Jake caught a glimpse of the driver through the passenger window. The man wore a trucker's cap and had a thick beard, but his face was pale as moonlight and his eyes were solid black holes that reflected nothing. Behind him came more rigs, each driven by figures that looked human from a distance, but revealed their true nature up close. It was like being followed by your own funeral procession, each vehicle carrying a driver who had died on these highways but couldn't find their way to whatever destination awaited beyond the veil of death. The convoy stayed with him for mile after mile, their CB radios chattering with conversations from decades past. Jake heard discussions about fuel prices from the 80s, complaints about new regulations that had been repealed years ago, and weather reports for storms that had ended before he was born. These scary trucker stories, real life had become his reality. A parade of the highway's casualties following him through the night like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Are we all just following someone else's path, trapped in routines that outlive the reasons we started them in the first place? One by one, the phantom trucks began taking exits that led to nowhere, their taillights disappearing into darkness that swallowed them completely. Jake watched his side mirrors as the convoy dissolved, each driver heading toward destinations that existed only in their memories of routes they'd traveled when they still drew breath. The last truck to leave was a familiar Peterbilt with chrome stacks, the phantom trucker from earlier in the night. As it passed his cab, the headless driver in the following rig raised one gloved hand in a final salute to the living. Every truck was driven by someone already dead. Jake drove alone through the pre-dawn darkness, the midnight convoy having dissolved into exits that led to graveyards and forgotten truck stops from decades past. His CB radio crackled with increasing frequency, picking up transmissions that shouldn't have been possible on any earthly frequency. The voices belonged to drivers he'd encountered throughout the night, but now they were broadcasting from locations that defied geography and physics. The headless trucker was calling from beneath Interstate 65, his transmission coming through speakers buried 6 feet under the asphalt, where his body had been laid to rest. Channel 19 buzzed with conversations between the dead, their voices layered like sediment in archaeological strata. Jake heard the phantom trucker discussing road conditions from 1987, the woman in white providing weather updates for storms that had ended before the interstate was built, and the black dog's howls translated into trucker slang by some supernatural interpreter. These true horror stories that actually happened were being broadcast live from the afterlife, a macabre radio show featuring drivers who had never signed off for their final time. What if the dead still needed to communicate, sharing information about routes that only they could travel? Jake reached for his microphone, compelled by some force beyond his understanding to join the conversation that spanned decades of highway casualties. To Breaker 19, this is Midnight Express. Can anyone tell me where this road actually leads? Static filled the airwaves for several seconds before a chorus of voices responded, overlapping and intertwining like a choir of the damned. They spoke of destinations that existed only in the spaces between mile markers, truck stops that served memories instead of coffee, and rest areas where travelers checked in but never checked out. The voices grew louder and more insistent, describing a network of phantom highways that paralleled the real interstate system. Dead truckers navigated these ghost roads eternally, carrying cargo that consisted of regrets, unfulfilled promises, and the last thoughts of accident victims. Jake's radio began smoking as the supernatural transmissions overloaded its circuits, the plastic casing growing hot enough to burn his fingers. Through the static and interference, he heard his own voice calling from somewhere far beneath the earth, already part of the eternal broadcast. Jake's CB radio finally died in a shower of sparks and the smell of burning plastic, leaving him alone with only the rumble of his diesel engine for company. The voices from beneath the earth had warned him about what lay ahead, but their final transmission had been cut short by interference that sounded like screaming metal. A rest area sign appeared in his headlights, promising facilities and relief from the supernatural marathon that had consumed his night. But as he pulled into the parking area, Jake noticed that none of the other vehicles had license plates, and their windows were tinted so dark they might as well have been painted black. The rest stop building looked normal from the outside, with modern architecture and well-maintained landscaping that defied the winter storm still raging around him. But the exit ramp that had brought him here was nowhere to be seen when he looked back, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness the moment his truck had passed the point of no return. The asphalt shadows real-life trucker horror stories spoke about were more than just metaphors. They were actual places where the highway folded in on itself, like origami made from nightmares and regret. Have you ever felt a place didn't want you to leave? As if the very ground beneath your feet had developed an appetite for human presence. Jake parked between a sedan from the 50s and a pickup truck that looked like it had driven straight out of the 70s. Both vehicles covered with a fine layer of dust that spoke of decades spent in this liminal space. The building's automatic doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing an interior that shifted and changed depending on which angle he viewed it from. Sometimes it looked like a modern travel center with bright lights and clean floors. Other times it resembled a roadside diner from the Eisenhower era, complete with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that played songs from artists who had died before rock and roll was invented. Inside, Jake found other travelers who moved with the slow, deliberate motions of people who had been waiting far too long for something that might never come. They sat in chairs that faced windows, showing different decades of the same view, some looking out at highways that hadn't been built yet, while others watched traffic patterns from years when cars had fins and chrome bumpers. The coffee was always fresh but tasted like it had been brewed from beans that remembered better times, and the vending machines dispensed snacks with expiration dates that stretched decades into both the past and future. The exit ramp only appeared at 3:33 a.m. Jake waited in the haunted rest stop until 3:33 a.m., watching the digital clock above the coffee machine count down the minutes with supernatural precision. At exactly the appointed time, the exit ramp materialized through the window like a mirage, becoming solid, its asphalt gleaming wet despite the absence of rain. He ran to his truck and gunned the engine, racing toward the phantom exit before it could disappear again into whatever dimension spawned these impossible roads. The ramp led him to a two-lane highway that hadn't existed on any map since the interstate system was completed decades ago. A neon sign flickered through the darkness ahead, advertising the Sleepy Time Motel with vacancy rates that promised rest for the weary traveler. Jake's exhaustion was bone deep now, his eyelids heavy from a night of supernatural encounters that had pushed his sanity to its breaking point. The motel looked like every roadside accommodation from the highway's golden age, with individual cabins arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central office. But the paint was peeling, the neon buzzed with an angry electrical hum, and the parking lot was filled with cars that looked like they'd been sitting there since the Eisenhower administration. The desk clerk was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected the fluorescent lighting like a nocturnal animal's. "Room 237 is available," he said before Jake could speak, sliding a brass key across the wooden counter with fingers that ended in yellowed nails. "Checkout time is 11:59 p.m. No exceptions." The highway horror stories Jake had heard at truck stops always mentioned motels where guests checked in but never left. Places where the management had developed an unhealthy appetite for travelers who wouldn't be missed by the outside world. Jake took the key, despite every instinct screaming warnings about places that operated by rules different from the civilized world. Room 237 was at the far end of the horseshoe, its door painted a faded red that looked black in the poor lighting. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive, making each breath feel like drowning in reverse. The bed was made with military precision, the pillows fluffed and arranged as if waiting for a guest who would never need to wake up again. What makes a place hungry for life, feeding on the vital energy of those foolish enough to seek shelter within its cursed walls? Checkout time was permanently 11:59 p.m. Jake fled room 237 before 11:59 p.m. could claim him permanently, the motel's hungry walls seeming to pulse with disappointment as he escaped their embrace. His truck roared to life in the parking lot, headlights cutting through darkness that felt thicker than normal air, more like swimming through black honey than driving through night. As he pulled onto the phantom highway, a pair of red taillights appeared in the distance ahead, glowing like the eyes of some massive beast lying in wait along the asphalt. The lights seemed close enough to reach in minutes, but no matter how fast Jake drove, they remained exactly the same distance away. Mile after mile, the red lights maintained their position ahead of him, neither growing larger nor smaller, despite his speedometer climbing past legal limits and into territory that should have been impossible for his rig. The taillights belonged to a vehicle he couldn't quite make out, something that might have been a car or truck, but possessed dimensions that hurt his eyes when he tried to focus on them directly. It was like trying to catch your own reflection running away from you. Always visible but never reachable, no matter how desperately you pursued it through mirrors that stretched into infinity. The paranormal road encounters had been building toward this moment, each supernatural event drawing him deeper into a highway system that existed parallel to the world he'd known. Jake realized he was following the same route the midnight convoy had traveled, chasing taillights that belonged to drivers who had been making this journey for decades without ever reaching their destination. What if some destinations were never meant to be reached, existing only to give purpose to travelers who had forgotten why they started driving in the first place? Jake's fuel gauge showed empty, but his engine continued running on something other than diesel, powered by momentum that defied the laws of physics and thermodynamics. The red lights ahead began pulsing in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, as if the vehicle he was following had somehow synchronized itself with his vital signs. Through his CB radio's dead speakers, he heard the faint sound of music, a song from his childhood that his mother used to play on long family road trips before the world became complicated and strange. He'd been following them for 300 miles. Chapter 18. Highway Patrol Ghosts. The red and blue lights appeared in Jake's mirrors without warning, their strobing pattern cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments dissecting the night. A highway patrol cruiser had materialized behind his truck, its emergency beacons reflecting off his chrome bumpers and casting dancing shadows across the phantom highway's cracked asphalt. Jake pulled over onto a shoulder that shouldn't have existed on a road that wasn't supposed to be there, his hands trembling as he reached for his commercial driver's license and logbook that showed impossible hours of continuous driving. The patrol officer who approached his window wore a uniform from the 1970s, complete with a wide-brimmed hat and a badge that gleamed despite the absence of any light source bright enough to make it shine. His face was pale as parchment, with eyes that held the flat, professional stare of someone who had been writing tickets for violations that transcended the normal rules of traffic enforcement. "The license and registration," he said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming through a radio transmission from the bottom of a deep well, filled with static and regret. Jake handed over his documents with shaking fingers, watching as the ghostly officer examined them with supernatural attention to detail. The scary trucker stories real life had warned him about officers who pulled over drivers on routes that didn't officially exist, writing citations for infractions against laws that governed the movement of souls rather than vehicles. "You're exceeding the spiritual speed limit," the Phantom Patrolman said, his pen scratching across a citation pad that appeared to be made from some material that wasn't quite paper. "Can duty transcend death itself, binding officers to highways they swore to protect even after their hearts stopped beating?" The citation fluttered in the wind as the officer handed it back, the paper feeling wrong against Jake's skin, too warm and slightly damp, like something that had been kept in a pocket close to a beating heart. The charges listed violations he'd never heard of: failure to yield to supernatural traffic, reckless endangerment of the living, and operating a commercial vehicle while insufficiently dead. The fine amount was written in a dark red ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And the court date was scheduled for February 30th, a day that didn't exist in any calendar used by the living world. The citation was written in dried blood. Jake drove away from the Phantom patrol car with a citation that burned in his pocket like a coal from hell's own furnace, the blood-red ink seeming to pulse with its own supernatural heartbeat. The highway ahead curved toward a massive steel bridge that spanned a gorge so deep its bottom disappeared into absolute darkness. As his headlights illuminated the structure's framework, Jake realized this was the completed version of the unfinished bridge he'd encountered earlier, but something was fundamentally wrong with its construction. The steel girders were twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly, and the bridge's surface rippled like water despite being made of solid concrete. The moment his tires touched the bridge deck, the screaming began. It started as a low moan that vibrated through his truck's frame, then built to a chorus of human voices crying out in agony from within the very steel and concrete of the structure itself. The bridge was screaming with the voices of every person who had died in its construction, every accident victim who had plunged into the gorge below, every soul who had been claimed by this stretch of cursed highway over the decades. Do some places absorb human suffering, storing it in their foundations like batteries charged with pain and terror? Jake tried to accelerate across the span, but his truck moved through the screaming air as if it were thick as molasses, each revolution of his wheels requiring tremendous effort to achieve minimal forward progress. The true horror stories that actually happened were carved into the bridge's railings, etched in letters that glowed with phosphorescent light spelling out the names and dates of every tragedy that had occurred here. The structure itself had become a monument to automotive death, a cathedral built from twisted metal and human suffering that served no god except the highway's insatiable hunger for victims. Halfway across the bridge, Jake's engine died despite having supernatural fuel, leaving him stranded above the abyss with only the screaming of tortured souls for company. The voices grew louder and more distinct, individual stories of lives cut short by mechanical failure, driver error, and simple bad luck converging into a symphony of automotive tragedy. Through his windshield, Jake could see figures moving within the bridge's steel framework, the ghostly forms of construction workers who had fallen during the building process and passengers who had died in crashes spanning 8 decades of highway history. Jake's engine roared back to life just as the screaming bridge began to crack beneath his truck's weight, hairline fractures spreading across the concrete deck like spider webs made from human suffering. He gunned the accelerator and burst free from the span's supernatural grip, his tires hitting solid asphalt on the far side with a jarring impact that rattled his teeth. Behind him, the The bridge continued its eternal chorus of the damned, voices growing fainter but never completely disappearing as he put distance between himself and that monument to highway tragedy that would haunt his dreams forever. A small figure stood beside the road ahead, thumb extended in the universal gesture for help that had become so familiar throughout this endless night of supernatural encounters. But this hitchhiker was different from the others. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, with blonde pigtails and a summer dress that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting from the 1950s. She carried a small suitcase and smiled with the innocent trust that only children possessed, completely unaware of the dangers that lurked along these phantom highways where the living and dead shared the same cracked asphalt. Jake pulled over despite every rational instinct screaming warnings about picking up passengers who shouldn't exist on roads that weren't supposed to be there. The child climbed into his cab with the fluid grace of someone who had been making this same request for decades, her small hands folding neatly in her lap as she settled into the passenger seat. "Can you take me home, mister?" she asked, in a voice like wind chimes made from crystallized laughter. "I've been waiting here for such a long time, and my mommy and daddy will be worried if I don't get back soon for Sunday dinner and church services." The asphalt shadows real-life trucker horror stories had warned him about were strongest in the presence of innocent souls trapped between worlds, children who had died before they could understand what death meant. "Where do you live, sweetheart?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer would be impossible. The little girl smiled and pointed ahead down the highway that stretched into infinite darkness. What if innocence could never truly die, preserving the pure hearts of children in amber made from hope and the belief that someone would eventually come to take them home to places that existed only in memory? She asked to be taken home to 1952. Chapter 21. Confessions Unbelieved. Jake drove through the dawn that never came, carrying a child passenger who pointed toward destinations that existed only in decades long past. The little girl chattered about her family's farm, her pet rabbit, and the new television set her daddy had promised to buy for Christmas, all spoken in the present tense despite referring to events from 70 years ago. As they drove deeper into the highway's heart, Jake began to understand the terrible truth about the road he'd been traveling. Every mile marker, every exit sign, every rest stop and truck stop had been feeding on the fear and desperation of travelers who became lost between what was real and what the highway wanted them to believe. The asphalt beneath his tires was not just pavement and aggregate, but a living entity that stretched across state lines like a massive neural network, connecting every accident, every breakdown, every moment of terror that had ever occurred on America's interstate system. The highway horror stories weren't just tales told by bored truckers to pass the time. They were actual experiences recorded by a sentient road that collected human suffering the way a spider collected flies in its web. What if the road you're on was never really there, but instead existed in the spaces between destinations, feeding on the journey rather than caring about where anyone actually needed to go? Jake looked down at his hands on the steering wheel and saw them becoming translucent, his flesh taking on the same ethereal quality as all the other drivers he'd encountered throughout the night. The little girl beside him smiled and patted his arm, with fingers that passed through his skin like he was made of morning mist. "Don't worry, mister," she said in her wind chime voice. "You'll get used to being part of the highway family. We all do eventually, once we stop fighting and accept that some roads don't lead anywhere except deeper into themselves, carrying travelers who forgot they were supposed to have destinations." The sun rose on a normal interstate where normal trucks carried normal cargo to normal destinations. But Jake's rig was no longer part of that world. He had become another ghost story, another supernatural encounter waiting to happen when the next desperate driver needed to believe that someone understood the loneliness of the long haul. The highway had claimed him completely, adding his voice to the CB broadcast from beneath the earth and his headlights to the eternal convoy of the dead. Like trying to wake up from a dream that had become more real than reality itself, he was now forever part of the asphalt's hunger. The highway itself was feeding on our fear. Jake Morrison's truck was found 3 days later at a rest stop in Kentucky. Engine running, logbook showing impossible hours, but no trace of the driver who had started the journey. The Highway Patrol classified it as another unexplained disappearance, filing the report alongside thousands of similar cases that stretch back to the interstate system's construction. But truckers who drive the night routes know the truth. They hear Jake's voice on Channel 19, warning about phantom hitchhikers and bridges that scream. They see his headlights in their mirrors, part of an eternal convoy carrying cargo that consists of human fear and regret. The asphalt remembers every soul it claims, weaving their stories into the fabric of America's highway system. So the next time you're driving alone after midnight and you see taillights that never get closer or hear voices on your radio that shouldn't be there, remember Jake's story. Remember that some roads don't lead to destinations, they lead deeper into themselves. And once the highway decides you belong to it, checkout time is never 11:59 p.m. It's forever. Drive safe out there and keep your eyes on the road ahead, not the shadows that follow behind.